Hello and welcome everyone to the Fate of the Union podcast, a weekly review of the biggest issues in national politics given from a conservative perspective. The show will also periodically address current true crime cases from across the country. Fate of the Union is hosted by Franklin Joseph, a lawyer and constitutional conservative. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also learn more about the show and its host on Twitter at FranklinFOTU. Now, let's talk about the fate of the Union. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Fate of the Union. I am your host, Franklin Joseph. As you can see, this is our second episode. If you haven't already, ask that you give the first episode a listen, in which I introduce the purpose of the show, the outline of where we see it going forward, along with a primer for where I see the country and President Trump's administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And that'll be kind of a jumping off point here in episode 2. As I mentioned in the first episode, we were going to produce 2 follow-up episodes that relate to the topic of the coronavirus and the administration's response here, and namely the mainstream media, or the corporate press, as Michael Malice more precisely terms it, and the response to the administration's actions, along with the obstructing politics of the left on the Hill during this process. In this episode, we're going to talk about the politics that have prolonged really the enactment of a comprehensive coronavirus stimulus package. So I think it's probably most useful to start at the end with the most recent developments with the relief bill that is currently on the table, and then kind of work backwards and examine why the fight has been so drawn out and why we're still trying to weed through a relief bill here as we go into April of 2020. Now, as of the recording of this episode, there is a landmark emergency relief bill totaling more than $2 trillion on the table in Congress in response to the coronavirus, and it's currently being held up and still awaiting a vote here as the time of this recording. We will note that a group of Republican senators, including South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, recently held a press conference to raise objections to the structure of the unemployment insurance provisions in the current stimulus bill. They argued the current language with a $600 boost in unemployment benefits could allow people to make more money with the unemployment insurance than they would in their current jobs, and thus boost unemployment numbers nationally. We'll get into those numbers and that juxtaposition of unemployment insurance versus actual gainful employment a little bit later in the show, and we'll see how it really is a kind of a current case study for a lot of the pitfalls and the contentions that some people right of center have generally against welfare programs, and here specifically unemployment insurance and unemployment benefits. But this is really only the beginning of the staggering shortcomings and the kind of sleight of hand that the Democrats on the Hill have tried to shoehorn into a coronavirus relief bill. But we will start at what is really the more mild objectionable provision that has been put into the relief effort. The objections brought to the forefront by Senator Graham really is emblematic of the general argument and hesitation that many on the right have towards unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, and the general welfare state in general. First is the amount to be paid. I think there's a natural inclination for those receiving these benefits that pursuing gainful employment while receiving the payments is simply not worth it if you stand to make more money by simply sitting at home and collecting the benefits. To be blunt, why go through the hassle of pounding the pavement and applying towards jobs, interviewing, etc., when you can more easily just stay at home and really make more money? Many people wouldn't. And it's understandable why. Second is the term or duration of payments. Previous reports from the Hill have pointed towards Democrat efforts to include similar payments with no terminable end. Thus, one would seemingly be paid, quote, coronavirus relief payments beyond when the pandemic ends, barring another congressional action to stop the payments. So in a lot of ways, the fight over this relief bill is just another case study in the pitfalls and shortcomings that this type of government relief can have. I would hope that Republicans stay strong in this fight and refuse to pass a bill with payments that are, A, profitable compared to full-time work, full-time employment, and payments that are not given a concrete terminable end in the very same bill. I think it's important that end or full duration of payments should be explicitly mentioned in the very bill that the payments get their life. Otherwise, we'll be looking to Congress again for guidance on when these payments should end. And then the kind of circular reasoning gets us back to the starting point where we see that no congressional action is completed on an expedited basis. So who's to say we'll be back in this position several months from now, waiting for when an end to the payments would be given down by Congress? Anything else would really be prolonging coronavirus-related economic hardships for the country into the future, beyond when the pandemic has subsided. Now we get to more of the juicy stuff surrounding federal coronavirus relief efforts in Washington. And by that I mean the pervasive identity politics of the left finding a home yet again, this time in the coronavirus relief bill in the proposals. Tucker Carlson recently had an important segment on the identity politics invading the relief discussions on the Hill. In the beginning of the segment, he stated, quote, "It's a terrifying moment, and in that moment, we need wisdom and steady guidance from our leaders. We need altruism. They need to care more about you than they care about themselves. But in Congress, they don't. The foremost concern of some members is having their own investment portfolios or making stupid partisan points or indulging their creepy ideological obsessions. Wondering why Congress hasn't yet passed a bill to help the country survive this? That's why." End quote. This proposal was so overbroad and aggressive in its identity politics, it drew full-on shouting matches up on the Hill between Democrat leadership and really normally reserved and even, I'd say, non-confrontational senators like Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins. Specifically here, Tucker noted the race-based hiring and compliance measures that were somehow built into the Democrat proposals and found themselves a home in an emergency relief bill from a worldwide pandemic. We have a cut here from Tucker's segment on the topic, and we'll bring that to you now.
Details of the Democratic plan became public today. Huge parts of the proposal have nothing to do with fighting the pandemic we're suffering through. Read it, and you will find disgusting little interest group handouts added by lobbyists. Worse, the bill is suffused with the cruel bigotry of identity politics. At a time when America so badly, desperately needs to come together, Democrats remain intent on splitting this country into warring tribes. It's shocking. When asked about her bill today, Nancy Pelosi blamed the Pope.
Last Thursday, Pope Francis offered the world this prayer: enlighten those responsible for the common good so that they might know how to care for those entrusted to their responsibility. Today, House Democrats are unveiling the Take Responsibility for Workers and Families Act, a bill that takes responsibility for the health, wages, and well-being of America's workers. The Senate Republican bill put corporations first, but because of the insistence of Leader Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats, progress has been made.
Even by Washington standards, shamelessness like that really has no precedent. Quoting the Pope, St. Nancy's coronavirus bill currently is more than 1,400 pages. It's not that long because it's a finely tuned fix to help the country through this disaster. No, it's that long because House Democrats have crammed it with totally unrelated political priorities. Identity politics, stoking racial division as usual, global warming, open borders. You should read it. Here's just some of what you'll find if you do. The bill would require every corporation that receives coronavirus aid to have officers and a budget dedicated to diversity and inclusion initiatives for a minimum of 5 years after they get the money, because that is going to keep America healthy and prosperous, just like it has. More bean counters making sure you're the right color before they give you a job. Okay. Companies would also have to produce elaborate racial reports for the government listing the skin color and the sex of their officers and boards of directors. They have to prove they give enough money to firms owned by women and non-whites, and of course, how much they spent on diversity initiatives. In all, this bill uses the words diverse or diversity more than 60 times. What does it have to do with a pandemic that might kill you?
And as you can hear from Tucker's segment that we just played, simply put, there is no pressing issue facing Americans that can walk back Democrat leadership from the intersectionality and identity politics that have really enveloped the party's general platform. If a worldwide pandemic and the threat of a disastrous collapse of the American economy cannot get Democrats to focus on a streamlined relief bill without race and gender politics invading it, then what issue possibly could? And the Democrat proposals don't even attempt to hide the ball. As Tucker mentioned, the bill mentions the word diversity 60 times. What is supposed to be a pandemic relief bill has mandates on race and gender-based hiring practices, climate activism, and protection for illegal aliens. The intersectionality marching orders of the party simply don't allow for a focused bill here. Pandemic relief here includes affirmative action, which includes climate change, which includes illegal immigration, normalization, and legalization, and so on. This, again, is a case study for how identity politics and the platform in general simply won't allow for a focused resolution to a dire issue facing all Americans. And although the pandemic and its efforts could be fatal for some Americans, the relief bill, insofar as one is proposed, should not really be all that complicated, at least in its framework. First, if any payments are included in the bill, they should be periodic and reasonable in an amount. It should not be a replacement of an ideal salary for all Americans. Applying for payments should not be a profit-making move that discourages looking for gainful employment simply because it doesn't make financial sense to do so. Instead, it should aim to cover the absolute necessary living expenses. It should be based on the number of people in the home, children to support, etc. Second, there absolutely needs to be an end date, a terminable, concrete end date to the payments. My suggestion would be for a max of 60 days of weekly payments that basically reflect the average state's unemployment insurance payments. That way, Americans can be reliably ushered through the pandemic safely, but we still don't have the looming issue of when the relief payments turn into free money. Also, as objectionable as affirmative action hiring policies are in general, the current relief bill cannot be polluted by such an idea. Businesses have enough problems, especially now that the pandemic has shut down many businesses completely or very close to completely. And implementing new, unnecessary, costly, unproductive, identity-based hiring procedures will only add another burden onto the business's hardships. The Democrat proposal championed by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer totals some 1,400 pages. Now that's incredible. The real formula is thus: number one, amount to be paid; number two, duration and schedule of payments. This relief bill should not even approach half the size of the Democrat proposal. Now, in the wake of the intersectionality-based relief bill we just spoke about, we were then presented with a slightly revised bill. The current version adds slight clarity. The most recent version of the bill would pay up to $1,200 in payments, but only to those individuals with incomes up to $75,000 per year, according to last year's data. There's also a payment for a family that made up to $100,000 last year. Thus, those making over these thresholds are paying a price and never seeing these payments. I think this provision is arbitrary and short-sighted for several reasons. First, the threshold placed at, say, $75,000 just smacks of arbitrariness. It seems like Congress just picked a round number, and that still sounds as if they are nevertheless not giving benefits to those that many would characterize as wealthy. Moreover, it's short-sighted in that the payments are based on last year's earnings. Suppose you made any amount over $75,000 last year, and as a result of the pandemic, you've lost your job. Have your duties or hours cut significantly? That would seemingly go unaccounted for in this bill. Further, it's not like all those making over $75,000 are necessarily more capable of getting by without these payments than those under the threshold. It's just a cursory review of their earnings in a year before the pandemic even began. The New York Times summarizes the bill as, quote, "Taken together, those measures form a novel, temporary expansion of the federal government's role in the economy. It will be essentially paying millions of Americans not to work and thousands of businesses not to shut down, even if they have no customers, in order to slow the spread of the pandemic. Its cost is more than double the roughly $800 billion stimulus package that Congress passed in 2009 to ease the Great Recession. Yet it still may not be large enough, given the enormous economic challenges the United States faces today. The bill includes $350 billion in loans for small businesses to help bridge their expenses for up to 10 weeks. Firms would not need to repay up to 8 weeks of the loans if they refrain from laying off employees or move by June to rehire employees they have already laid off." End quote. Also, the payments to individuals are thought to last just a few months. However, passenger airlines would qualify for $25 billion in loans and certain other guarantees, and also have access to a $25 billion in things like grants that might not have to be repaid as well. So here, what is termed a relief bill is certainly not bereft of its own bailout provisions. Now, recently, earlier in the week, Ben Shapiro's show over at the Daily Wire, Ben had a good review of the current proposal and his thoughts on where we stand in the current negotiations. And we have that for you here now.
But this thing appears to be a foregone conclusion at this point. So what exactly is in this thing? Well, there are a bunch of major spending provisions. Obviously, the New York Times has a rundown of some of the big provisions. They said the government will send direct payments to taxpayers. Lawmakers have agreed to provide $1,200 in direct payments to taxpayers with incomes up to $75,000 per year. By the way, it's an insane provision. The Democrats basically made it that if you make over $75,000 per year, you're going to have to pay that back to the government. So the government destroyed your job. The government destroyed your business. And now the government's going to sign you a check with the proviso that you have to pay it back if you make more than $75,000 per year. By the way, those are the people who make $75,000 per year who are probably in the long term going to be hit the hardest, not because they're the ones making the least money. Obviously, there are people who are making less money, but because those are the ones who are going to see the greatest gap between what they were making and what they are currently making, namely the difference between $100,000 and zero, as opposed to a person who's already on food stamps or welfare, or a person who's already on unemployment, or a person whose salary may drop from $60,000 to $35,000. If you drop from $75,000 to zero, that is actually a bigger drop. Now, again, That doesn't mean that poor people don't deserve the money. People who are poor do deserve the money. But the point is the people who are running the businesses are the people who are hiring the poor people. And a lot of those people are now being floated basically zero interest loans that are non-forgivable. According to the federal government, let's put it this way. If the Republicans had proposed this, everybody would be up in arms. Democrats proposed it. So, of course, it's no big deal at all. Families would receive $500 per child in an attempt to create a safety net for people whose jobs and businesses are affected by the pandemic. By the way, you get no money, none, if you earn more than $99,000 a year. So you get $1,200 in direct payments, up to $75,000 if you earn $75,000 last year, which, by the way, that's not what you're earning this year, not in this economy. So the means testing this stuff is very bizarre. Okay, and ending for people who earn more than $99,000 a year at all. So if you earned $100,000, you and your spouse, then presumably you make nothing. You go home with zero.
So there you have it. You have Ben Shapiro's take on the latest proposal, and a few things that I wanted to highlight, add some commentary onto what Ben very thoroughly explained there, is the means testing. The means testing is a bizarre measurement to examine emergency aid through. A pandemic that is affecting the entire country, the relief to which is being based on the means, the earnings that you had last year. If you were in a middle management position making high 70s, low 80s, which is reasonable in a lot of cities, and your job has been scaled back, your job has been, God forbid, lost completely, then your earnings last year really doesn't mean a hill of beans towards you and your family's survival right now for the next few weeks, for maybe even the next few months. So the idea that we're going to base it, relief efforts and essentially the government stipend on what you made last year is a bizarre metric. But again, for the federal government, it's really the only capacity they have is to essentially analyze a full calendar year's earnings data. But of course, here in March or April of 2020, the only capacity they have is assessing 2019's earnings data. If you've had your job scaled back or lost, again, you're going to be essentially forgotten about through the means testing of this bill. Moreover, and I think that Ben touched upon it, but I think it goes back to, again, the incapable and really the limit for the federal government's examination for relief efforts here. The cap on individual earnings is $75,000. For a couple, it's $100,000. Per child, as Ben mentioned, it was $500 per child. Why is it that every one of these caps or thresholds or amounts to be paid, it's funny that they're all perfectly round numbers? 75,000. Boy, that sounds clean. That sounds like a very round number, $750,000 of $100,000. And further, for a married couple, capping it at $99,000 a year. We can't venture off into six-digit income because that's where the quote-unquote wealthy people are. Again, depending on one's living expenses, how many children they're bringing up, $100,000 between a married couple may not be all that much. I've had the unfortunate coincidence in living in 3 or 4 of, relatively speaking, the more expensive counties to live in as far as cost of living goes, in a couple of the more expensive states to live in. And $100,000, again, between a couple is not as much as it may sound to some people. It's certainly not as much as it sounds to many members of the federal government who seem to see $100,000 as that evil amount. That's where the bad people, that's where the rich people operate, is into the six figures. Never mind the fact that you're basing those six figures as a combination of two people's income. Relating it back to a lot of my friends growing up here, being in my late 20s, $100,000 for a couple is, say, a decent part-time job, a part-time secretary, and again, a lower level supervisor at a regional business, maybe like a 75-25 split between the couple. It's, again, short-sighted, and working with the faculties that the government can work with is to make these arbitrary cuts at $75,000, at $99,000 a year, because we can't venture beyond that. And again, this all comes down to last year's earnings data, which is the limit of what they're capable of dealing with, but it does not mean anything to people who've had their jobs scaled back. Again, going back to what Ben said, there are many jobs, if you're basing it off, say, commissions, you're, say, a recruiter, a marketer, and you have a base level salary of below $75,000 or above $75,000, and your commissions bring you into the triple digits, you're seeing a significant cutback here. Not much in client intake right now for the last few weeks and for the next few months going forward. So the idea that we're going to base it off of last year's income data, when presumably most Americans' incomes have drastically changed, and the outlook for some people, maybe the rest of the calendar year will be significantly changed, I think is short-sighted. And Ben had a good summary, and again, kind of alludes to the point where a lot of members in the federal government just don't fully understand what it costs to bring up a child, to live in a two-person home, two-person apartment, and simply what most jobs pay. And again, what businesses are doing in March and April of 2020 to accommodate the drastic cuts in businesses and the effects that it has on the workers. And now we have just coming through the wire as we finish up this week's installment, the Senate has unanimously passed on a 96-0 vote the massive $2 trillion stimulus package late last night. We're just getting word of it now. And here's a little bit of the particulars of the passed bill in the Senate. This is from NBC News. The Senate approved the 880-page bill in a unanimous vote, so it is a significant cut down from the 1,400-page monstrosity we talked about earlier in the show. The measure would provide billions of dollars in credit for struggling industries, a significant boost to unemployment insurance, and direct cash payment to Americans. President Trump, for his part, did mention on Twitter that he intends to sign the bill in its current state, the 96-0 approved bill, if it does come across his desk. And the optimism portrayed by President Trump, the measured response from Senate members like Lindsey Graham, is combated by some Democrat members of the Senate, such as Bernie Sanders, who really made an aggressively incompetent assessment of the bill on the floor, basically attesting to the idea that what's the real issue, what's the real problem with $12 an hour workers now making, as he terms it, a few bucks more? What with the proposed bill's unemployment and other stipends, adding on to what would normally be their income. Of course, the sleight of hand is it's not, as Senator Sanders says, a few more bucks. It would be several $100s more. So the idea that these are workers on the dire straits and they're just getting that additional few bucks to make ends meet is certainly not accurate by any reasonable assessment of the bill. Being paid somewhere around $12 an hour and then getting unemployment insurance in addition to a stipend that amounts to several $100s is not anything approaching the chump change that Senator Sanders would have you believe is a result of the bill. So now as we wrap up this episode here, it is the night of Wednesday, April 1st. You very well may have heard now that President Trump has signed into law the previously proposed bill totaling some $2 trillion in relief. And here's just a quick background on just a breakdown of the CARES Act. This is from NPR. Individuals will receive an estimated $560 billion. Big corporations, and that's the airline industries, which we spoke of just for a moment ago, among others, the relief to those corporations will total $500 billion. Then small businesses in total will receive $337 billion. State and local governments, $339.8 billion roughly. So you're looking at just about $340 billion. Next is public health. Public health is just over $150 billion. Education and other is an estimated $43.7 billion. And finally, what's termed the safety net. The safety net portion of the relief will total some $26 billion. And it appears, at least by NPR's account of the breakdown of the bill, that the relief portions that were separated according to $1,200 a month for those earning up to $75,000, which we spoke about, along with payments to a married couple making less than $100,000, and the payments for child rearing related benefits, at least by this reporting, looks like it will remain largely consistent with the bill proposal, which we spoke about earlier. Now, there are, however, reports being released from the Hill that Nancy Pelosi, at least at this time, intends to introduce what would be a fourth bill related to coronavirus relief, allegedly looking to further protect workers to the extent that the previously described bill does not. At least what we're hearing now is that Nancy Pelosi has a mind to introduce yet a fourth bill, and we'll wait to see what is in that bill should it come to light. It is worth noting, at least now, again on April 1st of 2020, this is from the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's outlet. They report that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he will not be forging ahead with plans to introduce a fourth coronavirus stimulus package in the Senate, even if Speaker Pelosi has one prepared when Congress returns from recess at the end of April. So as it looks now for the next few weeks, again until the end of April, this is the relief bill. This is, again, the CARES Act is the coronavirus relief bill. Those appear to be interchangeable as of now. And at least the intent you get from Senate Republicans on the Hill is that any introduction of a fourth coronavirus bill is likely to be dead on arrival if in fact we do see one when everyone returns on the Hill at the end of April. In the meantime, I encourage everyone to go on medium.com/Fate of the Union. I have a write-up there about the issues that we spoke about earlier regarding the coronavirus relief efforts and some follow-up issues as negotiations at least are reported to be going on regarding that fourth bill. So I encourage everyone to go over to medium.com, Fate of the Union, and read the write-up that I have over there and a summary of where relief efforts and the negotiations started and a timeline of where we are today. In the third installment of the show, we'll be going over the mainstream media's response both to the pandemic in general, along with the Trump administration's measures in an attempt to combat the outbreak of coronavirus. Whenever you see an issue like a pandemic where you're inherently going to assess other countries and their responses and their capabilities in comparison to America's, you know already your spidey senses should be going off that you will hear a lot of the so-called claims of xenophobia and bigotry that come along with the plain comparison of America's response or America's measures in a certain capacity compared to other countries. Along with that comes the immigration restrictions that, of course, have been put into effect. And we all know when it comes to immigration restrictions and immigration law that built into the cake in the response from the mainstream media is those claims of xenophobia, bigotry, and really the unproductive and failure to offer any constructive feedback on what America's response should be to immigration measures. But that will be our next episode. Some of those takes do border on humorous, as you may have learned following. One of the stories involves drinking fish tank cleaner. So I'm sure you're aware of that story. So it'll be a little bit of fun going over that particular story. But there are a couple other particular instances from the media that are just really astonishing cases of TDS and maybe at the pinnacle of the syndrome, which is pretty surprising to say given the last few years and what we've seen since 2016 from the media. But anyway, that will conclude the second episode of Fate of the Union. I encourage everyone to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Listen to the first episode as well if you have a half hour and would like to catch up on where we started here. And in the meantime, you can follow Fate of the Union or at Franklin FOTU on Twitter, on medium.com, as well as franklinfotu@gmail.com. I look forward to talking to you again soon. This has been the Fate of the Union. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.